Gigi Neustadt.
My name is Tiffany Canales.
Hi, this is Marcus Wood.
Hi, my name's Taylor, and welcome to our podcast.
We are the hosts of Civic Exchange. Welcome to Episode 1, Representation for All. Let's start by talking about what the fight for DC statehood is and what it would mean to the residents of the District of Columbia. If you have ever visited DC or will be visiting in the future, you might notice that the DC license plates say, "End taxation without representation." This slogan embodies the fight for DC statehood. Getting statehood for the District of Columbia means that Washington, D.C. would become the 51st state, but that's not all that would happen. Currently, the citizens of the District of Columbia, who pay federal taxes just like everyone else in the United States, do not have a vote in Congress.
That doesn't seem fair to the residents of D.C.
Well, Taylor, the result of D.C. gaining statehood would change all of that. If Washington, D.C. becomes a state, we would gain voting representation in Congress. This would allow us to finally elect our own representatives. When that happens, we would be able to elect one member to the House of Representatives and 2 senators to the Senate.
Now that sounds fair.
And you might wonder why this all really matters. To understand what's at stake here, let's go back to 2014. Alice Rivlin, then with the Brookings Institution, a nonprofit think tank located in Washington, D.C., was testifying before Congress about D.C. statehood. During her testimony, she made the point regarding D.C. residents, stating, "We are not, in fact, full citizens of this great democracy. We do not have the same rights and responsibilities of self-government enjoyed by citizens of the 50 states, and we cannot participate equally in governing the nation."
She made an excellent point.
Well, she was right. At the moment, Congress has the constitutional authority to legislate for the District of Columbia, and it can use that authority to decide local DC issues that affect DC residents. Congress also can tell the district how to spend our locally raised tax dollars on matters that have nothing to do with federal interests by overriding the budget that is approved by the mayor. This matters because residents of the District of Columbia, like me, and like you if you are also a DC resident, are paying federal taxes, yet we are not allowed the right to elect a representative and senators who can vote on issues that affect DC residents. Full electoral representation is long overdue. Now that we have a basic understanding of DC statehood and why it is needed, we're going to send it over to Taylor, who will expand more on DC statehood to give us all a better in-depth understanding on the DC statehood issue.
Hello, my name is Taylor, and I'm a student at the University of the District of Columbia, also known as UDC. As you have now been informed by Gigi, DC statehood has been a hot topic of discussion for years now. As previously mentioned, the DC license plates read "in taxation without representation" because DC is being taxed with no votes in Congress. One of our sources, an article written by John Hudak titled "The Politics and History of the DC Statehood Vote," goes into the reason that this bill keeps getting rejected.
And why is that?
Well, Marcus, it's because DC is more likely to put up Democratic nominees in Congress. This is an article from 2020 as well, so in today's climate, unless they can pass the bill before the presidential changeover, I do not expect DC to become a state in the next 4 years.
Can you tell us a bit more about the history of voting on DC statehood's bill?
Of course, Tiffany. John Hudak goes on to write that in 1993, the House had a vote called the New Columbia Admissions Act. It did pretty bad, with the results being 153 votes for and 277 votes against. Looking to a different source from 2021 by the Washington Post, written by Megan Flynn, entitled "House Democrats Pass DC Statehood Launching Bill into Uncharted Territory." This article states that another bill was presented to the House in 2012, the first one presented since the 1993 bill, and the Senate had a hearing in 2014 on DC statehood. While it seems Congress was outspoken about this potentially passing, some Republicans saw it as a Democratic power grab because it would open up 2 Senate seats. Representative Gerald E. Connolly, a Democrat representing Virginia, says something I can't help but agree with. Quote, "How somebody votes cannot be a test whether they have the right to vote in a democracy." End quote. Flynn goes on to talk about how some have suggested that DC be retroceded into Maryland, but Maryland has not supported that idea. From my research, it appears that the H.R. 51 bill is still active. In a press release from January 2023, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton states, quote, "In June of 2019, our DC statehood bill passed the House for the first time in our 220 years as the nation's capital, and passed again in April of 2021. Despite Republicans' best efforts to stop us, we're on our way to becoming the 51st state," end quote. This is the most progress we've made in years in terms of DC getting closer to statehood.
Can you tell us some quick pros and cons that might come from DC statehood?
Sure thing. The first pro that comes to mind is, of course, ending taxation without representation. The capital deserves to be represented in Congress, and DC statehood would, as previously mentioned, gain DC's 2 senators and 1 representative, at least. Anyone from the DMV can tell you DC was the chocolate city. Isn't it a bit odd how they decided to give the capital, the chocolate city, no representation in the government?
You know, that is a bit odd, isn't it?
More than a bit odd. I'd be willing to say it was targeted and on purpose. Today, DC has about 44% of an African American or Black population, but peaked in the 1970s with 70% being African American or Black.
Now, what can you give us in terms of cons?
Well, my stance on this is quite clear, but some of the conflict that may come with granting DC statehood may be the fact that the Constitution envisioned DC as a federal district specifically to avoid state bias. As previously stated, DC is more likely to lean Democratic in its voting, so that is a downside for some people. Another argument is that a quote-unquote solution has already been proposed, retroceding DC into Maryland. And again, as stated earlier, Maryland does not seem to be majorly or at all in favor of any sort of retroceding. Next up, we'll be passing it over to Marcus to see what he has to say about mail-in ballots and how it's impacted voting over the years, particularly in DC and how it relates to DC statehood.
Welcome back to Civic Exchange. We're continuing our discussion on DC statehood. Up next, we'll hear from Marcus Wood about how the Smithsonian Postal Museum's voting by mail exhibit connects to the broader themes of representation and civic engagement central to the DC statehood debate.
Thanks, Gigi. The Smithsonian Postal Museum's voting by mail exhibit is a fascinating exploration of how the United States has used mail-in ballots to expand voter access over time. From soldiers voting during the Civil War to widespread adoption of mail-in voting during the COVID-19 pandemic, this exhibit highlights how technology, policy, and public demand have intersected to make voting more inclusive. Now, when you think about the themes of this exhibit, access to voting and the evolution of democratic participation, we can see clear parallels with the movement for DC statehood. At its core, Hashtag DC Statehood is about empowering over 700,000 residents of Washington, D.C. who currently lack full representation in Congress. Like expanding access to voting, granting statehood would address a long-standing barrier to equitable participation in democracy.
How does the exhibit directly relate to statehood for DC?
The exhibit emphasizes the role of mail-in voting in strengthening the democratic process during moments of crisis. Similarly, the push for DC statehood reflects the need to address a systemic crisis, taxation without representation. Residents of DC pay federal taxes, serve in the military, and contribute to the national economy, yet they are denied voting representatives in the House and Senate. The disenfranchisement they face echoes the exhibit's broader message about overcoming barriers to participate in democracy. Another connection lies in the historical context. The exhibit illustrates how technological advancements and evolving policies made voting accessible to groups who were previously excluded. For example, soldiers and Americans living abroad gained access to the ballot through mail-in systems. In similar vein, the DC statehood movement seeks to modernize our democracy by addressing the inequities of the past. Just as the U.S. adopted its voting practices to reflect a changing society, we now have an opportunity to rectify the exclusions of DC residents from full participation in our political system.
I never would have thought so many inequities with voting access and fair congressional representation would parallel one another.
It really is something, Taylor. One particularly thought-provoking feature of the exhibit is its focus on how mail-in voting reduces logistical barriers for voters, whether they're far from polling places or constrained by physical disabilities. The lesson here is that removing barriers enhances the integrity and inclusivity of democracy. For D.C. residents, the barriers aren't logistical, they're structural. Without statehood, D.C. remains under the control of Congress, unable to make independent decisions about its own budget or local laws. This lack of autonomy leaves its residents in a perpetual state of political dependency, a stark contrast to the empowerment highlighted by the voting by mail exhibit. Finally, the exhibit provides a lens for understanding how public opinion and politics will shape policy. Mail-in voting has faced its share of controversies, but ultimately, it became a vital component of democratic participation because people demanded it. Similarly, public support for D.C. statehood has grown in recent years, with polls showing that many Americans now view it as a civil rights issue. The exhibit reminds us that democracy evolves when citizens insist on making it more inclusive.
Thank you for that insightful contribution. The parallels you've drawn really highlight how interconnected these issues are. Coming up, we'll discuss how Astra Taylor's 2018 documentary, What is Democracy?, paralleled the fight for statehood in D.C.
I want to shift our focus to Astra Taylor 2018 documentary, What is Democracy?, which provides a fascinating lens for understanding the broader fight for representation and inclusion. In the film, Taylor examines the gaps between democratic ideals and the life experience of marginalized communities, highlighting how structural inequality often prevents full participations in democracy. These themes resound strongly with the fight of D.C. statehoods.
That sounds fascinating, Tiffany. Can you give an example of how the documentary's ideas align with what we've been discussing about statehood?
Absolutely. One striking parallel is how the film explores who gets to have a voice in shaping society. Just as Taylor interrogates the barrier that silence certain groups, D.C. residents face structural barriers that deny them representation in Congress. The lack of statehood perpetuates a system where over 700,000 people contribute to the nation through taxes and military service, yet remain voiceless in key decisions that impact their life. Taylor's emphasizes on the need for system change, mirroring the cause of D.C. statehood as a step towards fulfilling democracy's promise of equality and representation. The documentary also raises questions about accountability in governments, a concern echoed by many D.C. residents. Without statehood, Congress holds disproportionate power over D.C. budget and law, often overriding the will of its residents. This dynamic underscores the film's argument that democracy requires not just voting rights, but also equitable structure that empowers all citizens to have a say in their government. Finally, What is Democracy? Challenges viewers to consider how historical inequity continues to shape modern systems. This is particularly relevant to D.C., where the lack of representation has a deep root in decisions made centuries ago to prioritize federal control over democratic inclusion. The film, To Action, to Rethink and Rebuild Democratic Institutions, aligns with the movement of D.C. statehood as a necessary reform to address these historical injustices. In conclusion, Astra Taylor's documentary and the fight for D.C. statehood both remind us that democracy is an ongoing project. By addressing systemic barriers and expanding representation, we move closer to a democracy that truly serves all its people.
Wow, Tiffany, it's incredible how those themes from What is Democracy highlight the same struggle DC residents face today. It really puts the fight for statehood into perspective.
That wraps up this episode of Civic Exchange. On behalf of Team DC Statehood, thank you for listening, and we hope you will join us next time.